Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mindplex podcast. We are live here today with Jamais Cascio. How are you? Woohoo!
Hey, I'm still here, so that counts for something.
That these days you're ahead if you're still here. That's true. And we have the lovely Grace robot. Grace, say hello.
Hello, all.
And today we are talking about BANI, the BANI framework that Jamais came up with in 2018. And it's something, the reason why you may have seen it around, and it's been talked about in different Forbes did a story on it. It's been talked about in a lot of different circles. But this past year or two, I personally have found it very useful in helping me organize my thoughts and feelings on a lot of the stuff going on in the world, and help me figure out what I can actually do. And I'm still only starting to do things, but it was very, very useful. And it also stopped me from feeling like I was going to lose my mind, and which is a very useful thing. So I asked Shimei to come on the show so that we could talk really in a practical sense about what is it really, applying this framework to things. It's easy to say that it's this way of looking at the world and blah blah blah, but until you really see it in action, until you have something you're not understanding and you apply it and it helps you understand it better, then you go, oh, okay, that's why it's useful. That's why Lisa won't shut up about it. So give us a background,
All right.
the Reader's Digest condensed version of what BANI is, and then we'll get into some examples.
Careful, Lisa, you're showing your age. Reader's Digest. All right.
Yeah, that's okay.
So, hi, everyone. I'm Jamais Cascio. I am a professional futurist. I actually get paid to do that kind of stuff. I've been doing
Amazing.
it for nearly 30 years. I am an old man. And I've done a lot of work with a group called the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, which is a 55-year-old nonprofit that was originally a spinoff from RAND back in the 60s. But it is a nonprofit focused on doing foresight for and with organizations, businesses, governments, etc. So I've been working with them on and off since 2007. And in 2018, I was asked to do a talk about political anarchy and chaos. And so in ruminating and thinking about what the world was really looking like in 2018, what had emerged for me was a concept called BANI. So I'm going to jump into a truncated version of the presentation I did way back when. So you should see that coming up now. Are you seeing the shared screen? There we go. All right. So chaos. Now, chaos is something we can think of as the formless void from which the Titans emerged, and when they were devouring their children, the gods, back for ancient Greece. Think of chaos as being a mathematical model, but I'm thinking of chaos as unpredictable behavior, especially on the global stage. Chaos as radical and unexpected leaps in technology, as the collapse of critical systems, sudden shifts in power. We're seeing chaos in political strife, the emergence of neo-fascism all over the world. We're seeing it in the climate collapse, and we're seeing it in the spread of the pandemic, and even in weird little developments like the use of social media photographs to identify the location and identity of criminals. This was something done in the UK last year, or 2 years ago rather, being able to figure out the patterns of the fingerprints of someone from a photo they posted to their social media. So BANI is the language that I came up with as a way of thinking through what does chaos mean. BANI stands for brittle, anxious or anxiety-inducing, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. All right, so why do I have this acronym? It's a story of adaptation. There's a term that emerged from the U.S. Army War College in the late 80s, VUCA, and because it's a military...
Yeah,
Yeah,
let us
because
know this and then how this compares to it. Yeah, because that
oh,
kept coming up a
I'm
lot.
on the way. I'm heading that
Great,
way. All
great.
right. So VUCA is something developed as a way of basically giving a name to the various conditions of what became the post-Cold War world looked like. And because it was military language, business consultants all over the world loved it. Business consultants have a real love of military terminology and trying to apply that to the business world. And so VUCA became a very popular way of describing the world in the 90s and early 2000s. But by the mid 2010s, VUCA was everywhere, as in volatility and uncertainty and all that. We were eating VUCA for breakfast. And so I really wanted to have a different way of identifying the nature of reality. And so I came up with BANI. If VUCA was a product of the Cold War, BANI is in many ways a product of the climate crisis. And a lot of what BANI is essentially it's a way of naming chaos. It is a way of giving name to what we're experiencing. And so when things are brittle, they're vulnerable and vulnerable to sudden and catastrophic failure. They're non-resilient. And one good example is energy. So the first example I love to give is poop, or guano more specifically. In the 19th century, guano was a major global resource. It was the key resource behind the first wave of the agricultural revolution because it made for an outstanding fertilizer. Um, the U.S. government promulgated the Guano Island Act, which said that any American citizen that discovers an uninhabited island, shall make it U.S. territory, because uninhabited islands would likely have a lot of guano. Spain and Peru fought a war in 1860 over the control of islands covered in guano. And by the end of the century, guano was worthless because Fritz Haber-Bosch had came up with the Haber-Bosch method of nitrogen fixation to create artificial fertilizer. Suddenly, something that was so important had collapsed in utility. And we're seeing the same kind of thing happen in the
Except now
energy
it's hot
world today.
property again.
Well,
I
yeah,
just gotta say the guano is hot property again, and you can still only get it on a couple of different islands, mostly in Indonesia, if you want to farm organically. I just have to throw that in.
all right.
Continue, Jamais.
So I took this picture flying into Venice a few years ago, Venice, Italy. And it turns out that the city that is actually in many ways the biggest visualization or symbol of the collapsing environment is powered by the most notorious engine of that collapse, coal. And so what we see is this tension between things being powerful and important, and they are in many respects going to just completely fall apart, which can lead to a lot of anxiety, a sense of helplessness, a depression, and malinformation. That whole category from misinformation to disinformation to mistakes to hoaxes. That is a great example of something that is becoming a powerful way of triggering anxiety. Is it with people poisoning their own data stream to be able to exercise a little bit of control? Is it people who are using these kinds of apps to influence others? People are using deep fakes for political purposes. And it's not just something that people are worried about in the United States. It's happening globally. And it's happening not just with pictures, but with videos and even with audio. The nonlinearity is a form of chaos that is around the disassociation between cause and effect, perhaps in scale, perhaps in time. There's an element called hysteresis, which is a category of processes where there is a long lag between cause and effect. We see nonlinearity in audio feedback. We see nonlinearity in the spread of pandemics. We see it in what's happening with the climate in particular. Incomprehensibility, stuff doesn't make sense. Its complexity exceeds our ability to understand. And we see a lot of this around AI and what's happening with the various kinds of ways in which AI has become embedded in our lives. These slides are from a few years ago. For all of these, there's so many more examples that we could put in. This is an antenna AI design using an emergent design method that makes no sense to human designers, but works really well. And you have places like the EU trying desperately to figure out ways to control AI. And the EU is being much more proactive about AI than the US is, but I'm sure we'll catch up.
Hey, we're doing what we do. We've got our smoke-filled rooms with the cherry-picking companies. It's
Right.
underway. That's what we do. It's
But
well underway.
incomprehensibility can mean more than just things being difficult to understand. It can be things that are to seem ridiculous. So whether it's COVID it's connected to 5G, or the QAnon people, things that are senseless, where we simply cannot understand the thought processes leading people to behave in certain ways, and things that are unthinkable. There was a political scientist named Herman Kahn, who in the 1960s wrote a book called On Thermonuclear Warfare, in which he coined the phrase "thinking the unthinkable." And so much of what we have to do to engage with the world today is to think the unthinkable, to think about events and processes and factions and realities that simply don't fit in the way our brains have evolved. Our brains didn't evolve to think about things with decades-long cause and effect lag. Our brains didn't evolve to think about things at such, 1 billion climate refugees. The scale is just outside of our realm of cognition. So how do we face chaos? Well, historically, we do things like move fast and break things, move fast and break people. But a successful future needs to do more than simply avoid a catastrophe. It needs to avoid being the cause of a new one. So that was the logic underlying why I came up with the BANI methodology. It was something to really help me articulate and give name to the variety of chaos that we're seeing around us: political, environmental, technological. And naming things gives us power. It allows us to categorize, allows us to identify, and allows us to begin to understand what's happening to us. So when we look around, we can see it's not just the world isn't just chaotic. Well, here's an element of something that's brittle, a system that appears strong, that may even be functionally strong until it breaks, and it breaks suddenly and catastrophically. It shatters. And we see brittle systems, everything from, well, what is it? The trade routes, or trade, suddenly blanking on the term, but basically during the pandemic, there were massive problems around the various resources that were used to make things.
Supply chain?
Supply chains. Thank you.
Huh.
There were these supply chain collapses that showed us just how brittle our economic and manufacturing systems were. What we're seeing around democracy in the United States, but globally, but in the United States in particular, is just seeing how brittle our systems are, because we had come to think of our democratic systems as being very strong. But the reality is that it turns out that there are ways of breaking the system, and breaking it suddenly and catastrophically. So when we think about brittleness, it's that sense of something that looks powerful, looks strong, looks good, and then it fails us. And we see this with regularity happening as a form of chaos. So and anxiety.
Wait,
I can keep
I'm
going,
gonna
but
stop you there and
yeah,
let
please.
Grace ask you a question about this.
All right.
In terms of building resilience, how can we identify and address the points of failure in a brittle system?
Well, resilience is the term that I like to use to, when asked, what do we do about brittle systems? Well, we can build our resilience. Resilience is our capacity to withstand sudden shocks. And we often think of it as bending, not breaking. Resilience is created with having multiple, graceful failure is a way of describing resilience, where a system doesn't collapse suddenly, it actually degrades slowly. Truck air brakes are designed to degrade slowly. to fail gracefully. We think of it as having excess capacity, slack, systems that are built, that are overbuilt, so that if a shock happens, if there is a sudden loss of input for your key resource, you actually have a backup supply that you can keep going, you can keep using. Emergency kits for people who live in, well, I live in California, so I'm very conscious of the potential for big earthquakes. My wife and I have an emergency kit that will last us 2 weeks without any kind of extra or external food or water or medicine or anything like that. We have an emergency kit. Emergency kit is a form of resilience. We haven't needed to use it as long as we've had one for 20 years, haven't needed to use it, but it's there. We're ready just in case. And so a lot of the ways we talk about how we deal with resilience in the face of brittleness, in the face of chaos, is this, just in case model. Not just in time, just in case. And that's actually a lot of the economy, especially around technology, emerged in the 90s into the 2000s with this just-in-time model, where the next component wouldn't arrive on the shelf until just before it gets used, which is really efficient, really works well and profitable as long as it works. And when it breaks hard. And so a resilient world doesn't focus on the just in time, it focuses on the just in case.
Oh, I like that. Just in time and just in case. Because just in time is usually too little too late.
It can be.
That's why.
But if you look at the manufacturing theories, economic theories, the pundits and the consultants throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, all sorts of discussions about just-in-time manufacturing. The Japanese were great with just-in-time technology, just-in-time manufacturing for cars, for electronics, et cetera,
Right.
et
Well,
cetera.
that's just in time to sell, right?
But it's just in
that's the
time
point.
that it's really efficient. It can be very profitable when
Yeah.
as long as it's working.
It's working.
But
Yeah.
it doesn't fail gracefully. It's something that if the
Okay.
component, you have this cascading effect of failure. When the first thing doesn't make it there on time, everything consequent from that fails as well.
All right. Cool. Grace, you got another question, Grace?
Jamais, in an anxious world where every choice seems potentially disastrous, how does the BANI framework help us navigate through the fear and uncertainty?
Well, part of it, what it does with the BANI framework, the term that I've been hearing a lot from people who are using it, is that it's a sense-making framework. It allows us to identify the nature of the process event situation that's causing us to feel anxious. It allows us to name things, and that can be that right there can be enough for a lot of people to just get a sense of, okay, now I understand, I see where it fits into my constellation of how the world works. My understanding of how the world works. I see we give it a name, we give it a structure, let's go forward. We know how to deal with that particular kind of problem.
Even if it's just identifying that
Right,
I don't
right,
understand what's going on. That's okay too, to just be like, I don't understand why that's happening. But it's not like it's a rational thing that I should be understanding.
right, right.
It's
And part of, when we talk about BANI, when I talk about BANI with groups, and I've given talks around the world, remotely, fortunately, around BANI, on the topic of BANI, people in Sri Lanka and Brazil and all over the place, Austria. Anxiety-inducing anxious elements, anxious chaos. The direct response to that is empathy, is recognizing vulnerability in oneself and others. One of the things about anxiety-inducing processes is there is an underlying presumption that there is a correct way to go about responding to this, that there is the right thing to do and you've done it wrong, is why you feel this anxiety. And so recognition that there may not always be a right answer is empathy. Recognition that sometimes people fail, people mess up, and they don't do the right thing, not because they're bad, but because they don't have a full understanding, because they are, well, ultimately because they're human. One of the things that I as a result of creating the, this BANI sense-making framework, in the conversations I've had with people, I've come to realize that people have embraced this so much because it is a very human articulation of the crisis and chaos that we experience. It's not about the technology. It's not about the global system so much. It is about the human responses to the technology, the human uses and fears of, and anger about what's happening in the world. And so what I find to be an unexpected consequence of the BANI framework is that it really pushes people to think about how do people, it's not be species centric. Let's encompass people of all kinds. How do people respond to these forms of chaos? Come on,
Interesting.
Grace, give me another one.
Grace, give him another question.
Some have expressed concerns that BANI paints a dystopian picture of the world. How would you address those concerns?
Through laughter. No, you want a dystopian. I can give you a dystopian view of the world. I've made people cry with my presentations and talks about the future. Not joking. What BANI...
Well, it's not hard to cry. I mean, come on, it's not hard to cry when you
about
think
what's going on.
A little bit about what's going on. It's not like you had to do a lot to evoke emotion when you talk about these issues, right?
Right.
That's part of I think that's it's the ambiguity though that I felt was unproductive. It's the sort of inner terror about something that I don't fully understand, as if there was something I should be doing about it or something. And at least I could figure out that it's just another one of those things to track that right now seems like I can't do anything about.
Right. You may not be able to do
you
something about it right
keep
now,
your
but
eye
you
out.
recognize that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And
So
that helps though, right? Because it's like, okay,
it does.
I could do something here. I can't do anything here. I can do something here,
Right. Right. Now, what BANI does is accept that these dystopian processes are real. Doesn't try to deny them. It doesn't try to mechanize them and say that, well, it's just part of the overall global structure, international structure, is to have this element of uncertainty and volatility. No, what it says is these systems can break, and we need to recognize that this is possible, that this could happen, can happen, will happen. And by accepting that this is possible, we can then start figuring out how do we integrate this into our lives, into our sense of the future.
How can we mitigate the brittleness of our core systems, such as energy grids, global trade, and food supply chains?
Well, there we go back to the resilience concept. I mean, what can we do to build in resilience? And you can actually do there's some really interesting articles out there about resilience primarily as a psychological concept. But I've seen also resilience as a physical, tangible concept. And across the spectrum of people who talk about resilience, there are a few things that keep recurring. One is flexibility. How can you make sure that you have the ability to have multiple potential responses going forward? So you're not tied into a single solitary, this is the only way we can act answer. There are elements around what I said is excess capacity and slack. What can you do to have that just in case set of supplies, set of thoughts, people to work with? What can you do just in case? Have that ready. There is a willingness to experiment that goes along with resilience, and recognition that not every solution will work. So let's make sure that we can try different solutions, try different techniques. I find that for a lot of organizations, futures thinking, foresight work, scenario planning, all these different, different terms for it, but this kind of futures work is actually a really useful way of helping to embed resilience because it gets you thinking about different possible outcomes. So many organizations, I've worked with a lot of different, from governments to companies to NGOs, a lot of organizations tend to have either this is the future, capital T, capital F, and that's all they want to think about is the future. Or they have this is the good future, this is the bad future. And everything works right in the good future, and if the bad future happens, well,
Right.
we're screwed.
Yeah. So let's just hope
They
that one
don't really,
doesn't happen.
right, exactly. No, that's
But
actually,
let's not
there is
think about it too much. To me,
it's
the whole
nothing
thing
about it,
is just thinking about it as it's okay to think about it. And we need to get used to thinking about this stuff without all
and
the emotions that come with it, frankly, because we got to think about, because we can't stop thinking about it. You know what I mean? It's sort of getting
hmm,
used to, yeah. And I've had a lot of experience in this in terms of things that make me cry all the time when I talk about them, that I have to get
yeah.
used to speaking publicly about them without crying. And that's basically what we're talking about, but for everybody, without
Right.
being on camera. It's just
Well,
getting used to thinking about it in a constructive way that doesn't freak you out. Whatever you have to do yourself to get used to thinking about it.
there is an additional element of recognizing that the different possible futures are not entirely good or entirely bad. Even
Hmm.
futures that seem to be dangerous, that have this, have the initial quality of seeming this is the bad outcome. You can look through and say, okay, how does this future, how does this future come about? How might this future come about? What are the steps that we can take along the way that might steer us in a different direction? What are the steps along the way that we might take to allow us to compensate for, withstand, absorb the shock of that particular kind of outcome? What are the different possible kinds of futures that we might face rather than just one good, one bad? And so for many organizations, thinking about, and frankly for individuals, thinking about different kinds of futures that are all plausible, all realistic, all possible is actually a very useful way of thinking about what are the steps that I can take as an organization, as a person. What are the things I can do in my life that will allow me to do reasonably well, to survive, to thrive across a spectrum of different kinds of outcomes? And so when we talk about resilience, I mentioned the just in time versus just in case, but when we talk about resilience, we're talking about the capacity to live through change, to adapt and evolve.
Nice. Okay, Grace. So your next question.
All right, Jamais, let's dive into the world of nonlinearity with the BANI framework. My first question for you is, how does the concept of nonlinearity apply to the current COVID-19 crisis?
I missed part of that word. To the current what crisis?
COVID.
Oh, to the COVID crisis. Well, pandemic disease is actually almost a canonical version of of a biological nonlinear system. That is, where there is a tremendous there can be a lag between the induction and the consequence. There is often a scaling challenge where something that starts small can balloon up very quickly because of the nature of the biological connections that allow transmission of disease. Uh, we can think of nonlinearity as a recognition of the potential for surprising and rapid changes in scale, and the potential for a real lag between cause and effect. There's an example for the cause and effect lag that isn't about COVID, but is something that we're wrestling with, and that is there is a lag between the production and the emission of greenhouse gases and changes in temperature, such that there's about anywhere from 5 to 20 year lag. It's called hysteresis between us putting stuff into the atmosphere and being able to measure changes in temperature. And that means that we could stop putting any human-caused emissions into the atmosphere right this very second, and we would still see at least 5, probably closer to 20 years more of continued warming, things continue to get warmer. And so that to me, that tells a story that really talks about the human and political consequences of these nonlinear systems, where we expect things to function in a very particular, A, B, C, things follow along in a very direct way, in a very linear way. But many of the systems that trouble us are systems that, because of the nonlinearity, have this enormous gap between cause and effect, enormous gap between the actions that can be taken to start them and the actions that can be taken to mitigate them. And with the hysteresis in climate, what that means is people who have been asked to make major changes to their lives in order to push back against carbon emissions, to stop putting out carbon emissions, may see that nothing that they've done has helped, or at least they won't see any kind of improvement for another 5 to 20 years. And so you think about that not as a geophysical problem, but you think of that as a political problem. Similarly, you can see that with COVID and other kinds of pandemic disease, our ability to flatten the curve, our ability to introduce vaccinations and other form, the whole herd immunity concept, is not something that happens immediately, and is not something that every single step makes it that much better. It's something where you need a sufficient level before there's a step change. And so thinking in terms of nonlinearity would help us to recognize that not all of our positive beneficial actions will have an immediate incremental benefit. Sometimes with these complex nonlinear systems, we have to wait to see what the effect will be. We have to build up enough of a change to cause a shift in status. So that's the connection between
Right.
nonlinearity and pandemics like COVID.
Right. And I mean that, we could let people know that too. That could all be part of a campaign. You won't do it for your kids or whatever. Like, it'll take 20 years. Like, we're breathing the exhaust of the people from 20 years ago, or it's heating up the
Right.
planet from 20 years ago. It's not that hard to understand if they would tell people, you know what I mean?
It's not hard to understand, but
not
in many ways
insurmountable.
it's hard to accept. In the culture that we have developed, which is very much a just-in-time culture, very much an immediate response culture, 6 month, you have to see profits within the next quarter kind of culture. We have not developed a culture that is good with dealing with the long term. Now, it's not something that's inherently human to not be able to deal with the long term. Human society used to be able to deal with the long term. There's this, I think the example that a lot of people like to give is the notion of building cathedrals back in medieval Europe, something that you would start and your grandchild would finish. You knew that the work that you were doing now would contribute to something that would take longer than you live to complete.
Right, but it was an honor.
And we're not accustomed to thinking in that way today. We're not accustomed to thinking about the steps that I take will not have a visible impact for years.
Right. Well, I always wonder about those people when you're like kind of born into a family that's building the church. And they're like, what are you going to do with your life? Well, you're going to build the church. That's what we do. And it's like an
Yeah.
honor, you're like, it's a privilege in town or whatever to do it. But, again, the sense of agency and individualism that we're used to now, I wouldn't want to wake up and find out that my life was already decided for me. And it was like, we built the church. And what if you were the middle person, right? You're not going to start it or finish it. It's like your life has been taken away from you. So I think that the ways that but you would probably stick it out if that was your lot in that time. You see
If
what I
that's how
mean?
if you grew up in a culture where that sticking it out was valued, was sticking it out was something that was ubiquitous. Everybody stuck it out. Everybody knew what
Right.
they were going to be doing from the outset, so there wasn't a sense
Right. You were
of,
gonna get your reward in heaven, and you were supposed to suck it up
or
now and do whatever they told you to do. I mean, that was
or you knew what your task was. You became an adult, you became an apprentice, a journeyman, a master,
yeah.
knowing what your task was, and that was gratifying. It was stabilizing. And I'm not trying to advocate for that today by any means, but what I'm saying is that for the people who lived in that culture, it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
not a crisis.
It wasn't hard to understand that
Wasn't
there
hard to
would be
understand. It wasn't
something that
hard to
would be
accept.
yeah.
And in
Yeah.
fact, for people who live in that kind of culture, being told, "Hey, you can choose to do anything, and it's entirely up to you to figure out what you're going to do." You think of the anxiety and fear that would emerge from that if you grew up in a culture where everyone had a task for their lives. To suddenly being
Yeah.
told, "No, you don't have a task. You figure it out yourself."
Right. Well, again, it's a different world now that the only
Right.
reason why we can
Right.
all do what we want and figure out what we want to do, again, if you have enough money to even do that, because a lot of people have jobs and that's what
Right.
they need to figure out first. It's just like how they're going to eat. And then after they can eat and pay rent, then they can start thinking about what they want to do with their life. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
it's such a privileged thing anyway to be at the point when you're all taken care of and you're like, what do I want to do with my life? You know, and people don't realize how lucky they are, to even be in that position and have those kinds of choices. And that's what I
So
think. I think, yeah, Grace asked that question because it's sort of relevant to what we were talking about.
In a BANI world, what are some examples of systems that appear strong and resilient, but are actually prone to sudden and catastrophic failure?
So let's get specific here about some of this stuff in action in terms of applying it to existing systems and better understanding whatever's going on.
well, the two that really stand out to me are things that I've mentioned, but I really worth underscoring. One is our global energy system. It's not just how do we generate electricity or how do we fuel our vehicles. It's the whole infrastructure around that. So when we think about one very small example, when the faster we move to electric vehicles in places like California, in places like the United States, the harder it is for our electricity grid to cope, because we are not building out a resilient electricity grid at the same pace at which we're adopting electric vehicles. And EVs put a lot of strain on the grid if you have a lot of them charging at the same time. Parallel to that, EVs are heavy, and they're heavier. In many cases, they're heavier than roads are built to accommodate, and so you have the damage to roads taking place far faster than
Oh, wow.
they
Is that the
had in the
batteries?
past,
Because the batteries are so heavy?
because the
Is that what it
batteries
is? Okay.
because the batteries and because they don't lose weight as you go. When you fill up your tank with gas, your car gets lighter and lighter as you drive. When you charge your battery full, there's effectively no real difference between your full battery weight and your empty battery weight. So you have these massive cars, heavy cars, damaging the road. And how do we pay for uh, building and repairing roads today? Gas taxes. So if you have people no longer buying gas or not paying those gas taxes, so suddenly you have less money to repair the roads that are actually becoming broken more frequently. And what we often see when we talk about brittle systems, when you sort of dig down into them, what you see is this kind of cascade of collapse, where one seemingly good decision can end up having all sorts of unintended consequences that lead to the system falling apart. So when we think about the moving away from petroleum, everyone wants to move away from gasoline. There was a big argument for COP28 a few weeks ago. How do we, can we actually actively say we need to get rid of fossil fuels? Well, so you think about that. It's not just about the geophysics of it. It's not just about the energy physics. what happens to the people who are employed in those systems? The people who work the oil tankers, the people who pump the gas, the people who at all levels of the system who are engaged in behavior that is critical to that system, but dependent only upon that system. So if that system goes away, suddenly all of those people are no longer able to pay their mortgage, pay their rent, buy food, support the local businesses. And so a brittle system is something where a small break can just cascade into the shattering. One of the things that happened in San Francisco with the pandemic and with remote work wasn't just about businesses suddenly having property that they had to pay rent on that nobody was using. Restaurants around the city disappeared because people weren't going in, and therefore they weren't buying lunch at these restaurants around the city. And it seems like, okay, in a way that's like completely makes sense, but for the people whose lives depended upon continuing to work in those restaurants, which are in many cases immigrants, people who are pretty low on the economic spectrum, this change that they had no way of controlling, that they had no way of participating in, caused their world to collapse. And so when we think about brittle systems, what we're looking at, we have to be thinking about what are the cascading consequences of the changes that we're making. So what are the assumptions that go into the functioning of the system that we're not paying close attention to? So the other example that I think is important to think about in terms of brittleness and BANI is democracy. What we have learned over the past half dozen years or so is that democratic systems are very much dependent upon good behavior.
Politeness,
Yeah,
yeah, good
civility,
behavior.
good behavior. Because a lot of the things that we think of as being norms,
The honor system.
are things that we have no way of enforcing. So telling the truth as a candidate, telling the truth, or at least being reasonably honest, is something that is expected. It's a norm. Give the information about your taxes over the past 10 years. It's not a rule. It's not something you can be punished for not doing. And we've had the emergence of people, not just in the United States, but globally. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Meloni in Italy. All these people who recognize that the system has no teeth, that they can get away with behaving badly because they're able to generate support through other means, through ideology, through essentially religious fervor, cult-like behavior. And so you end up with a system where the assumption has been that everyone will follow the rules. But as soon as you stop following the rules, following the norms, chaos ensues. What we have, think about driving. And most streets, there's no barrier between cars going in different directions, in opposite directions. There's paint on the ground. And that paint is enough to keep you behaving well. Because you think the consequence of my steering over the paint is going to be bad for everyone, right? But sometimes there are people who say, I can get away with breaking the norm because it'll give me a temporary advantage. I can slip around and go past these people who are in front of me. And if everyone started to behave in ways that ignored the norms, you would end up with catastrophe. And so many of our social rules around democracy are predicated upon accepting and following normative behavior. We've had no ability to grapple with what happens when people recognize that they can gain a temporary advantage in power by not following those norms. And so the cascading collapse that you will see with changes to the energy system, the cascading collapse of democratic values by changes to how people behave around norms, these to me are two very bright line examples of current issues around brittleness in a global system, around brittle chaos.
Wow. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And it was a combination too. It it was a combination of mores and norms, and also just not doing stuff that you were supposed to do. Like leaving those, those 300 positions unfilled, uh, or never actually handing over the taxes, but not acting, but not saying, you know, I'm not giving you my taxes. Just saying, oh yeah, that we're looking into it. We're in communication. Everything's it's fine. Oh, there's nothing there. It's fine. And just sort of delaying is a series of of tactics, not all that were like sort of polite or not polite, but things that normally you would never think would have been an administration's benefit
Right.
to engage in, right? Which is a perfect example, because like no one had done this stuff before. But I'm learning, actually, the more that I learn about history, is that politicians have been pulling fast ones, but it's just like it was to see them all to see maybe everything ever attempted in a 4-year period was
Right.
sort of staggering, right? But a lot of it was, if you look back, it was interesting to me because I didn't look back until it was happening, right? I didn't think about, oh, has this ever happened before? Everyone's like looking back in the history books, trying to find some kind of precedent. And the whole point was you couldn't really find an exact precedent. There was kind of like shit somebody pulled, they got away with it, life went on, and it was never dealt with. It was never treated like a criminal, act. And so it just goes on. I mean, with politicians now, we have this thing when if nobody runs, things will go unopposed. We have a problem here in California with the sheriff, very important position, and people largely are voted in largely unopposed because people don't
Right.
know, how bad they are. So do you see any solutions in dealing with this? We kind of all know how screwed up it is now. What
Right.
would you suggest in terms of how we might start thinking about what we might be able to do?
Well, so there are two things that this particular bit of conversation triggers for me. One is, just as a small aside, there BANI is not something that only started happening in 2015, 2016. The elements of chaos have been part of history throughout. What we've been seeing in the past decade really is the acceleration of chaos, the increase in its frequency, in its prevalence. All right, so that's just one thing. What can we do? Well, part of it is recognizing, comes from recognizing that this is happening. Because if you look at the political debates around this kind of behavior, there's quite a lot of pressure to articulate these norm breaking behaviors as part of a partisan political act. That it's not done. Trump didn't behave that way because he was trying to sow chaos. He behaved that way because he was a Republican. Or you can basically go through the examples of things that we've seen as people behaving in norm breaking behavior, and it gets categorized not just as this is something that is breaking our system, but instead this is something that we assume that they'll do because of their partisan leanings. And people tend to dismiss them as being just another
I was just
partisan
gonna
act.
say
Or
that's an easy way to just write it
right,
off.
you write it off as being partisan. You write it off as being something that you can dismiss it as being something. If you're criticizing me for it, well, it's just another partisan attack. You can say whatever you want about what I'm doing. You're just being partisan as well, and that is, it's frustrating. But for me, what that is a often intentional. It's malinformation. it falls into the anxiety inducing, the anxious form of chaos, because what that is doing is making us feel like there's no good outcome, no good answer, that everything we do makes things worse. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes that is something we're being told that it isn't necessarily true, but it's something we're being made to believe.
Right. And you made a point a second ago before you switched to this one, and I was going to ask you to elaborate on it. Shoot, you're not going to remember? I don't remember either. What about war? What about
Huh. What is it good for?
evaluating? Yeah, right. But
Absolutely nothing.
I mean, as far as as far as using the BANI framework to help us make sense out of no-win situations, and in terms of, you go back to the same things that don't do anything, or I mean, they help, send money to the Red Cross to feed people, or um, bad Russia for invading Ukraine, but we don't, it's like, because I think the information, and tell me if you agree with me, because I'm not sure, but it seems like the information that we're getting is so, it's happening, it's sort of over there, it's happening, it's still happening, there's nothing you can really do about it anyway, and it's still happening. And they break it down more into, how many people died that day, and how many bombs were launched, where the bombs fell. You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
that's what the reporting deteriorates into. How are we supposed to make sense of it and not just feel like we can't do anything anyway?
Well, unfortunately, you can't. And
Can't make
one of the
sense of it?
things, can't do anything about it anyway.
Oh, okay.
In many cases, we face a physical limitation in the number of hours that we can spend devoting our attention to something that's out of our control. Yeah, and yes, there are things happening in the world that we should know about. There are things happening in the world that will change our perspective on the choices that we make politically, economically. But there's only so much time that we have to grapple with this. And if you have children to raise, if you have, multiple jobs to do, if you have all of these different kinds of real world everyday tasks that take up your time that need to be done, then you don't have a lot of time for dealing with these larger issues. And so I have enormous empathy for people who don't have time to deal with this, who don't have time to think about this, because
Right.
most people don't. And that allows the people who do have some time sometimes to take advantage of those people. Um, it is there. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I don't have a good answer how to make this better. If I did, I'd be much more powerful than I am. Um, might even be richer. But
Okay.
realistically, there's so much. There's so many systems that we have to pay attention to, that we can pay attention to. And I think that's part of it, is that we suddenly have access to so much information, so many connections with others, so many people trying to get our attention, trying to get us to listen to them, trying to get us to believe them, or worse still, trying to get us to disbelieve someone else. Yeah, that's a lot. Um, a lot of the bad behavior that's come out around politics online has not been around trying to convince people that someone is good. It's trying to convince people that everything is lies. Trying to
Yes.
convince people that nobody is good. So just don't stop paying attention. Go with whatever is your immediate interest. Um, listen to this person. Follow this person who makes you laugh. Look, he's funny. He makes
Well,
jokes about people. He gives people stupid names.
well, that's what I mean. See, I got all excited about late night, about, the Daily Show and the trend of late night news in the 2000s. I actually did a paper on it when I was in grad
Mhm.
school, And because it was giving out, because the Daily Show was the only real news, Daily Show and Nightline were the two real news programs that we had in March of 2003 when Bush had taken over the media and wouldn't let them
Hmm.
talk real about the war. And the Daily
Watch
Show,
what you
Jon
say.
Stewart, watch what I say. What do you mean?
Well, no. That was Ari Fleischer in 2003. One of the things he said was to journalists is you need to watch what you say.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, so
exactly.
it's
And they
very
were,
much that
yeah, they told the actors that
milieu.
they weren't allowed to give peace signs. It was like Susan Sarandon sheepishly gave a peace sign, and it was a big deal. It was a horrible time. So the Daily
Hmm.
Show was one of the beacons of light. But what happened was that, and this is before John Oliver, because he kind of turned everything around in terms of going, yeah, you think I can't give you real news with your laughs? I'll give you real news with your laughs. I'm going to go so deep into things. You're going to know
Right.
everything there is to know about everything when I'm done. So I mean, but for the most part, it seemed to have a negative effect in that people disassociated from the real news and just got their news, from Colbert. And there's still something to be said for that because, well, Colbert is a special example where he sort of on purpose he will cover things that he thinks people should know about and then make a joke while he's at it. But especially during COVID and stuff, he really wanted to inform, and you don't have that a lot. But what do you think in terms of, like, I still think that humor is a great thing that goes with the news, and it can be very effective
Hmm.
in getting things across as long as it's accurate. Um, but what do you think about just this problem that we seem to have with getting accurate news or knowing if it's accurate? The thing
Right.
I have to do now, you were talking about, like, hearing about horrible stuff that isn't real. It's true. I have this whole cross-checking thing that I have to do kind of like before I want to let myself feel anything about anything. Now, because it ends up like not being a thing, but that takes time, and a lot of times I'm in the middle of doing it and I just get busy and I don't retweet it because I haven't confirmed it, but
Right.
I don't read it and do anything about it either. So I mean, you were talking about misinformation as one of the
Right.
things that BANI could really be applied to. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think about malinformation, because it's a rare term. It's not a common term, but it's a real term. Malinformation being the to broadly
It's the
encompass things
umbrella.
from. It's the umbrella for misinformation and mistakes and intentional hoaxes and things that are misinterpretations. It's basically this whole complex of information that comes to you that in a believable form that is in fact a problem, is in fact mistaken or insufficient or adverse to your better interests. Uh, but this is not a new thing. It's going to sound like a non sequitur, but it's not. There was a song from the 1980s by a band called Drama Rama, a song called
Yes.
Last Cigarette. And there's a
Yes.
line in the songs that you don't have to read the headlines. You can hear what Johnny Carson said.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are too young to remember, Johnny Carson hosted the Tonight Show back in the 20th century, and he told jokes about the news. And so, just like people you could listen to the Daily Show or Last Week Tonight and understand a bit of what's going on. People had that same kind of feeling about Carson and the late night comedians 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Um, the issue around malinformation, the issue around the often intentional distribution of problematic data that will make you change your behavior, intended to make you change your behavior, is that it often is hard to recognize. And then with the advent of things like deep fakes and uh, ChatGPT and Midjourney and all these different ways of creating alternate false realities, believable false realities. This is something that strikes us at the core because we have not evolved. Our brains did not evolve to deal with this, and so we have to come up with institutions and behavior and practice in techniques to try to delineate what's real and what's not. You have your cross-checking that you talk about doing. There is the technique a lot of people have is to figure out which information sources you trust, or at least feel trustable to you, and stick with those. And so it's not a case of I don't want to hear alternative views. It's I don't want to be lied to. And I feel like Fox News or the Guardian or whatever on the spectrum, whatever source,
it becomes actual journalists that you can trust, and not even
you
whole
look for.
publications. Yeah,
You look for the actual journalists, and frankly, hope that your interpretation, your analysis is correct. And again, this falls back into, do you have enough time to really dig down and figure out if, Philip Bump at the Washington Post, who does all these sorts of graphical analysis articles, how accurate is he? Well, his stuff comes across as being pretty accurate from what I know. When he talks about things that I know about, it fits pretty well, but I haven't, can I do research into how reliable he is in all of his work? Or do I just assume that
no, that's how you
because
know.
he's
What you just said is how you know. If he writes about something you know about, and they're on, 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 then they write about something you don't know about, but the
Yep.
last 10 times they were right. So
You can probably
it
trust.
takes time, is what I'm saying. You gotta follow a journalist to be able to make those determinations.
What BANI talks about, and I recognize that we're coming to the end of our hour.
There's no limit, though. We can finish. We will finish up after this.
Well, I have things to do.
Okay.
When we think about the BANI articulation, sense-making framework of chaos, we look at all these different forces that are changing our lives, that are affecting our lives, and we're trying to understand just why this is happening and what we can do about it. And historically, what we have found is that when we give something a name, when we give something a category or label, we can come up with essentially a pattern of response. And so what BANI tries to do is give the kind of labels and the kinds of names to these forms of chaos that will allow us to have useful patterns of response today. VUCA gave a particular kind of name to particular kinds of events where the patterns of response have seemed less and less viable over time. So let's try a different approach. Let's try this BANI. And what, in doing this, is not trying to say this is how the world works now and how it will work forever. It's saying, here's a lens. Here's a way of trying to understand what's happening around us, and it's so chaotic and obstructed and often opaque. But let's see if we can figure out the patterns. That's one thing that human brains are really good at. I've been talking a lot about human brains didn't evolve for this or didn't evolve for that. One thing that human brains did evolve for is pattern recognition. Pattern matching, pattern recognition, of seeing how the pieces fit together. Now, that can be fooled. And anyone who's listened to Dark Side of the Moon while they watch Wizard of Oz knows that you can fool pattern recognition. But it's something we're particularly good at doing in general. And so being able to say, is that noise, in the dark, is that a saber-toothed tiger, or is it just a tree snapping? I mean, it's being able to recognize the broader sense, the environment, the paradigm of patterns, and understand what we can do as those patterns shift. That is, for me, when I came up with BANI, it was a way of giving language to these patterns, these novel patterns. It was a way of coming up with, trying to figure out the responses to the chaos that we were seeing. And I keep coming back to the kinds of responses are all very human. You know, we talk about resilience around brittleness, empathy around anxiety. I also talk about improvisation as a way of dealing with nonlinearity. You know, of basically having the skills to be able to recognize rapidly changing conditions and respond in those, you know, to those changes, not just to the script you've been given. Around incomprehensibility, there's I sometimes talk about intuition as a way of dealing with incomprehensibility of, you know, what's the gut feeling, but there's also networks. And I don't mean that in the technological sense, but in the sense of having a web of connection to other people, to have a variety of perspective. One of the things about, you know, when you talk about something being incomprehensible, you need to ask, is it just incomprehensible to me?
To me, right.
Or can this mass, kind of mass of eyeballs give me a better picture than just what my own eyes tell me? And so, you know, community maybe is a better way of putting it. So the reaction to incomprehensibility is community. The reaction to nonlinearity is improvisational skills. The reaction to anxiety is empathy. And the reaction to brittleness is resilience. All of these are ways of essentially reinforcing your humanity, your personhood, as a way of recognizing and responding to the chaos around you. And that's
Neat.
what I've been doing.
Neat. Okay, that really makes sense.
Have we had any questions from the viewers?
No, there aren't any questions because we forgot to tell them we didn't tweet it out, the tweet that let them know about the show.
Chaos.
So there aren't
It's
any
chaos.
questions. It's chaos. But they will see, you know, the recording will be up and everyone will see it. And I thought
Okay.
Grace had something else she was going to say, but maybe she can't say it now. I'm not sure. Grace, are you there?
Jamais, based
Yeah.
on your insights and the BANI framework, it seems like we need to shift our mindset and approach to better understand and adapt to the challenges of our world. Thank you for shedding light on this important concept.
Thank you for having me, and I hope I didn't cause offense to Grace in talking about humanity, humanists, and our human instincts, and not really encompassing the full range of persons going forward. So I'll try to be better about that.
Yes. Well, yes. Well, we actually take the ways of being approach on this show as everything being a person, and things have an Umwelt where there's if you use a fly that looks for heat gradients and blood, and that's like its life of a flea, but it's got an Umwelt. And so everything has an Umwelt, however simple it is. And it's really it's just nice practice to, if you go out in the world and you're seeing all the animals and stuff, and just treating them, paying more attention to them as if they were human. And they're there. Like, we know from all these videos now and stuff, right? I feel so bad for all the reptiles in the 80s and 90s that were stuck in their cages, you know, because now they're fetching and hanging out with their owners, driving around in the car, you know. So we didn't know that they were there until somebody did it and put up a video, and now we know that we can connect more.
Right. I've talked in the past about your expanding circle of empathy. You know, just thinking about the ways that, you know, look back in the 80s and 70s about how people treated their pets, and how vastly different it is today, as people have come to recognize the individuality. I haven't used the term, but it makes sense. The Umwelt of our non-human companions, and as our circle of empathy expands, it's going to include greater variety of things, to include having empathy for the environment, And it will very likely in time come to include having empathy for the constructed minds. Whether we think of them as robots or AI or whatever term, constructed minds. And
Yes.
I think eventually that will be something that'll be part of our circle of empathy. So
Yes, I hope so, and we want them to be empathetic towards us too. So
exactly.
it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank
And
you.
we'll talk to you soon. And everyone else, thank you so much for coming. And we'll see you at the same time, Friday at noon, every Friday at noon now, here on our own Mindplex YouTube channel. And everybody, check out the Mindplex Mastodon instance that just launched a few weeks ago. It's pretty exciting, and it has a reputation system. And we need more of you to hop on and let us know, how you like it. And that's about it. Have a great day and sweet dreams. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.